non-religious buildings in England that after 600 years are still used for, broadly speaking, their original purpose. The Guildhall of London, however, is one of them. A Guildhall of sorts has probably existed on this site since the reign of Edward the Confessor, and from Saxon times, merchants and craftsmen had organised themselves into guilds. Originally social and religious fraternities, they developed into organisations for the promotion of trade and the protection of members' interests. They did not lose their connections with the churches in their district or their patron saints, but they built halls in various centres of their work. These centres were well defined. In Cordwainer Street were the shoemakers. In Westcheap, the saddlers and goldsmiths. Further east were the mercers. In Bread Street, the bakers, and the tailors in Merchant Lane and Threadneedle Street. It was while the first building was standing that it cemented its city powers with judicial privilege and political privileges from the Crown, as well as for its first mayor. Around 1298, an idea was mooted to create a new civic centre, primarily perhaps a new civic chapel, but by the 1330s, there was also an intention to rebuild the Guildhall. This, of course, needed a wealthy sponsor, and the man for the role seems to have been Sir John Pulteney. He was a financier with a shrewd business sense and had become one of the richest men in England. The building was to be dominated by a magnificent great hall. The new hall was to be much grander than its predecessors and had to reflect the increased complexity of city government. The original Undercroft, which still survives, probably hosted the Court of Hustings, and above in the main hall hosted the Common Council and Mayor's Court. This new hall was not just a building, however. It was a district within a city, a sort of precinct. The original having stood alone, this new one had a defined gatehouse, 7-foot-high walls. There was no facade to the street and no real sight from the outside world. It was completely hedged in by houses, shops, and buildings. Within the compound was a chapel, probably built by the king's own craftsmen. There was a hall used as the main market for wool and cloth, all set in fine gardens with trees and flowers. It was the civic, economic, and judicial heart of the city. The Guildhall emanated the Palace of Westminster, which had been the principal royal palace since the reign of Edward the Confessor. Around 1411 to 1450, more improvements to the city were mooted, and rebuilding the Guildhall was one of them, and to be built by the mason John Croxton. It was commissioned by none other than the Lord Mayor, Richard Dick Whittington. This is the hall that survives today, and to its western half, the Undercroft is of the old building. It was magnificent and an engineering feat to cover. The roof, thought to be supported by vast stone arches, the project was ambitious and included the rebuilding the Guildhall Chapel and college buildings and building a new library. The library was paid for by the executors of Richard Whittington. Then there was the new chapel, which, like the Guildhall, took 20 years. Inside there were dioceses at each end, where courts could be held. On the north side was the entrance to the most important court for the mayor. In separate building, at the back of this, was a smaller courtroom for the aldermen. Croxton's Guildhall was no ordinary building. It was deeply traditional structure, steeped in rich symbolism. Work started just north of the great commercial thoroughfare of Cheap on the building from which the city was to be governed. In this year, wrote the chronicler Robert Fabian, was ye Guildhall of London begun to be new edified, and old and little cottage made into fair and goodly house, as it now appareth. Significantly, it was called the Guildhall, not the Town Hall or City Hall, and included parts of two previous buildings on the same plot, the first one dating back to the 1120s. By this time, nearly 100 guilds or companies existed and dominated the whole life of the city, and inevitably the administration fell upon them. Self-governing with their own traditionals and ceremonies and dress, The guilds had strict rules of professional conduct. Broadly, they were divided into the trade guilds and craft guilds, and the usual admission was by apprenticeship. Only by years of practice that the craft guilds maintained could workmanship reach the high standards which would make London's goods famous the world over. So a boy of 12 or 14 would be apprenticed to a master craftsman for a term of 7 years to learn the mystery of his craft. At the end of this indenture, he became a freeman of his guild. Free, that is, to serve any master or set up on his own. The city was divided into 25 districts or wards, whose elected representatives might, after the manner of other cities, be expected to have charge of administration. But so powerful were the guilds that in 1376 they were given the right to elect all members of the Common Council and city's parliament. This was modified to include both ward and guild representatives, but the election of the mayor, sheriffs, and chamberlain remained, as it still does, in the hands of the companies. To the Court of Aldermen sitting in Guildhall for the tasks of keeping law and order, seeing to sanitation, street paving and water supply, looking after public morals, regulating prices, and countless other duties. Great rivalry existed between the companies. In 1515, the Court of Aldermen of the City of London settled an order of precedent for the 48 livery companies then in existence. Based on those companies' contemporary economic or political power, the 12 highest ranked companies remain known as the Great 12 City Livery Companies. Today, there are 110 city livery companies, all post-1515 companies being ranked by seniority of creation. The merchant tailors and the skinners have long disputed their precedence, so once a year at Easter, they swap between 6th and 7th places. This mix-up is a favourite theory for the origin of the phrase at 6s and 7s. As has been pointed out by at least one master, merchant tailor. However, it is possible that the phrase may have been coined before these two companies, tailors and skinners, resolved their dispute, which arose from their both receiving charters in 1327, with no proof surviving as to which was granted first. The butchers were known to have a hall outside the city walls as early as 975, and there was a fraternity of bakers in 1155, but the company with the oldest known charter, 1155, is the Weavers' Company. Altogether, there were about 100 craft guilds. When the new Guildhall came to be built, the city companies contributed to the cost, helped by bequests and subscriptions from individual wealthy citizens. Henry V granted a free passage for 4 boats and 4 carts to bring lime, ragstone, and building materials to the site, but funds dried up after 2 years. And the Common Council decided that to raise money, taxes should be imposed on the apprentices, deeds, wills, and letters of patent. All fines were to be contributed to the new work. The revenue from London Bridge tolls was also to be used. Even so, it was not until about 1422 that the Great Hall, second only to the Westminster Hall in size, was ready for transacting municipal affairs, electing the Lord Mayor, sheriffs, and the city members of Parliament, and the holding of banquets and important receptions. From the day that King John signed the Magna Carta of 1215, the city had been given the right to elect a mayor each year, previously appointed by the sovereign. The position had been instituted since 1189. All kings had recognised the importance of the London merchants. They had to come to the city for loans to fight wars, and the merchants granted, knowing that trade was affected by England's strength abroad. Henry V borrowed for his French campaign, and when he returned victorious from Agincourt, he was given a great banquet at the Guildhall. Legend insists that at the end of the meal, Richard Whittington, the mayor, took the royal bonds against which he and his associates had lent £60,000 and threw them into the fire. Even if the story is untrue, it indicates the value in hard cash that the city placed on a successful war. The king also knew that the country's prosperity depended greatly on the efficiency of the companies and the quality of their goods. So the companies had been given privileges and monopolies. The weavers were granted a charter by Henry I and were the first of many to trade under royal licence. During Edward III's reign, the goldsmiths, skinners and drapers and others received exclusive trading rights. By the end of the 15th century, 25 companies had received charters of incorporation, and these gave them more prestige and trading advantages. They bestowed an inalienable right of existence, which could not be threatened from reign to reign or by changing powers within the city. Each year in October, the masters and the wardens of the company summoned their liverymen of the Guildhall to elect the mayor for the coming term. This custom, stretching over the centuries, has set the ceremony in an inflexible mould. On the hustings at the east end of the great hall, strewn with sweet-smelling herbs, the city dignitaries gathered, while the commons cry in tones, "Oh yea, oh yea, oh yea! You good men of the livery of several companies of this city, summoned to appear here this day for the election of a fit and able person to be Lord Mayor of the city for the year ensuing. Draw near and give your attendance." The names of the aldermen who have served as sheriffs are read out one by one and voted for by a show of hands. To the aldermen then falls the duty of selecting the mayor from the two who have most votes. In the following month, the mayor, the term Lord Mayor came into use only after 1354, which was granted by Edward III, is shown to the citizens. This is done in a procession through the streets, which dates back to 1378, and probably before. At first, the processions were simple, with the mayor was on horseback, accompanied by aldermen and chief citizens. Then in 1401, there is the first mention of minstrels. 14 years later, John Wells, a grocer, was one of the first Lord Mayors to introduce a touch of pageantry when he set up 3 fountains running with wine at Cheapside Conduit. The wine was served to the public by 3 virgins representing mercy, grace, and pity. From 1422, the Lord Mayor's show took the form of a cavalcade by water to Westminster, and it gained in splendour over the years. After the show, there's a banquet in the Guildhall, a tradition dating back 4 centuries, which replaced feasts previously held in the halls of the livery companies. At the banquet, on every occasion inside the city, the Lord Mayor takes precedent over everyone but the sovereign. In June 1397, the mayor in office died, and Richard II accepted the interim choice of our well-beloved Richard Whittington, in whose fidelity and circumspection we do repose full confidence. This was the first of 1 short and 3 full terms of office of London's most famous Lord Mayor. The known facts of his life were meagre, and while there are a lot of scoffing at the legend, it is possible, because of the gaps, to weave a story on their framework. If never a poor scullion, he was a 3rd son, and so hardly likely to have started life well off. He was born in 1360, and his father appears to have been Sir William Whittington of Portley, Gloucestershire. He came to London and was apprenticed to a member of the Mercers Company. Legend is helped by the curious fact that when he was only 21 and his apprenticeship just over, he was sufficiently wealthy to subscribe to a city loan. He married an Alice Fitzarryn, whose father, if not Whittington's master, was a rich man. Returning back to the Guildhall, the porch of the hall faced Guildhall Yard. And this was the public face of England's wealthiest corporation. The whole surface was covered by blank arcading and niches containing 4-foot-high statues. At the top was Christ in majesty, below on the next level, figures representing law and learning, and then flanking the archway. 4 female figures representing the virtues of discipline, justice, fortitude, and temperance, trampling vice beneath their feet, attributes the Lord Mayor needs to exercise his office. During the Great Fire, 1666, the Guildhall was damaged, but not destroyed. On the worst day of the fire, which started in September the 2nd, on a Sunday, in Pudding Lane at 1 o'clock in the morning. The worst day was Tuesday. Fire north of Threadneedle Street, Cheapside destroyed, St Paul's Court at 8 p.m, organised demolition started. Guildhall catches. Flames burst through City Wall into Liberties by way of Ludgate. Over Fleet Ditch, prisoners in the Fleet were released. Salisbury Theatre and Inner Temple were on fire. Wind rose in evening before subsiding. By Wednesday, the 5th of September, 5/6 of the city had been destroyed. A fall of the wind and demolition effective and fire checked was by midnight. Fears of fresh outbreaks from sparks blown from smouldering buildings, and there was a royal proclamation for relief. On Thursday, the 6th of September, 200 soldiers brought in to prevent further outbreaks, but fire decisively halted at Fetter Lane, Cock Lane and All Hallows, Barking. The King addressed the refugees at Moorfields and scotched rumours that the outbreak was the result of papist or foreign plots. The Guildhall was repaired and it lost its precinct. We're not certain who oversaw the reconstruction, but it's likely to have been Sir Christopher Wren and Robert Hooke. Away went the gatehouses, away went a corner of St. Lawrence Jewry and several other buildings, and in their stead, a new forecourt was built. Over the next many years, the hall has undergone numerous refurbishments, influenced by architects at the time and the success of trade around the world, including the opportunity to use the new Hindu style conjured by travellers returning from India. However, despite architectural flourishes, the corporation has always been about the protection of its ancient rights and privileges, about reinforcing the closed shop that was the city's government. As a result, it has become increasingly obsessed with its medieval origins. In the 1860s, the city architect, the great Sir Horace Jones, started the process of undoing the 18th century alterations to the medieval Guildhall and re-Gothicizing it. He was also commissioned to build an extension to the building for a museum and library, which are impressive and were completed in 1872. The war damaged the Guildhall badly, and the architect chosen to rebuild it afterwards was Sir Giles Gilbert Scott. He repaired the medieval hall with great care, but had little respect for much else on the site. This was swept away, and a whole new wing of administrative offices took their place. This, of course, in many ways was essential. The corporation, like all other local authorities after the war, was taking on a much wider range of responsibilities, and these required managing by professional officers. The new building was to the north of the Guildhall. Sir Giles died in 1960, and his son, Richard Gilbert Scott, took things on. After the war, Guildhall Yard was no wider than the hall porch. The yard was bounded on its west by the court's buildings and on the other by the remains of the bombed-out Victorian Art Gallery. The yard was so narrow that a London taxi could not turn in it and had to reverse out. This caused complete chaos on ceremonial occasions, so the plan was to demolish the conglomeration of Victorian and Edwardian buildings in front of the Guildhall to make a fashionable precinct, the sort of large paved area found in so many post-war shopping malls. The final stage in the hugely long, expensive and ambitious post-war reconstruction of the Guildhall began in 1997 under Richard Gilbert Scott with D.Y. Davies Associates. The new building was to be where the bomb-damaged Guildhall Art Gallery, Courts of Law and Chapel once stood. This building now acts as the city's art gallery. The very fact that the Guildhall is still in use shows that the corporation is deeply aware of its ancient roots and ancient privileges. This is really only a glossary of a building steeped in so much history and hidden secrets and stories, and can be exampled that in 1988, the Museum of London Architects made an astonishing discovery that changed the face of Roman London. The capital's only Roman amphitheatre was in Guildhall Yard. During an archaeological dig taking place in preparation for the new art gallery building project, when short stretches of Roman wall were unearthed in Guildhall Yard, the site became a protected monument. The City of London decided to integrate the remains into proposals for a new art gallery, and construction work began in 1992. Alongside ongoing excavations, the surviving remains include a stretch of the stone entrance tunnel, East Gate and arena walls. They are protected in a controlled environment 20 feet below the modern pavement, in which they can dry out slowly without damage to the ancient stonework. The original extent of the outer wall is marked by a circle of black paving stones in Guildhall Yard. In 2002, the doors to the amphitheatre opened for the first time in nearly 2,000 years. And as you can see, the banquets are still as sumptuous and as colourful and delightful as they have always been since this new hall was built. And the story is never ending.